Abortion funding. How lawmakers on Capitol Hill are trying to limit the flow of money to Planned Parenthood. American Jobs Plan. The Biden administration makes a three-pronged push to sell the proposal across the country. Promoting peace. How Pope Francis is trying to prevent a bigger war between Russia and Ukraine. And election anniversary. A look back at the day Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI started his pontificate. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, April 19, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. On Capitol Hill, the race is on to prevent tax dollars from being spent on abortions here in the United States and beyond. Several bills are being introduced to prevent the nation's largest abortion provider, Planned Parenthood, from receiving funds. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, conservatives that I talk with say that ever since Xavier Becerra was confirmed as the Health and Human Services Secretary, it appears that the Biden administration is really trying to get rid of Hyde Amendments and anything that protects anti-abortion provisions. They say that they are going to continue to fight it and that they want it stopped.
Our concerns are with how quickly this administration is moving to a pro-abortion position. It's not just a pro-choice, it is a pro-abortion position.
Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn tells me with Democrats in charge of the House, Senate, and White House, they continue to push their radical agenda on Capitol Hill. She adds her bill, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, should have been considered bipartisan.
If they're aborted and they survive it, that child would get that same care that a preemie baby would get, and they oppose that.
Republican Senators James Langford of Oklahoma and Joni Ernst of Iowa just introduced the Protect Funding for Women's Health Care Act. The bill prevents any taxpayer dollars from going to the nation's largest abortion provider, Planned Parenthood. It comes as the Biden administration issued a proposed rule to allow Title X funds to go to abortion providers. Title X is a federal grant program for low-income patients to receive family planning health services.
Right now, the numbers aren't there for us, except there is midterm elections coming up in about a year and a half.
Pro-life organizations like March for Life Action say it will continue to closely follow the actions of the HHS Secretary and current administration.
We see it as our job to expose all the wrongdoing that's being done by this administration. It's coddling of Planned Parenthood. It's ramping and ramping up taxpayer funding of abortion through its so-called COVID relief and the infrastructure bill.
It is important to note that I tried to get a comment from HHS and Planned Parenthood. I never heard back from HHS, but Planned Parenthood, a spokesperson, did send me a statement that reads in part, congressional Republicans continue to focus on baseless political attacks. Like many other local nonprofits and healthcare providers, the independent Planned Parenthood organizations who are awarded PPP loans met the eligibility requirements established by both Congress and the Small Business Administration. Senator Rand Paul and other Republicans are wanting them to pay back the $80 million that they received in PPP loans. We'll continue to follow that story and bring it to you later in the week. From the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is calling for sanctions against a Democrat member of Congress for what he says was an incitement of violence during a protest over the weekend in Minnesota. Representative Maxine Waters of California joined a protest in Minneapolis.
We have to let people know that we're not going to be satisfied unless we get justice in these cases.
The 82-year-old Democrat told protesters to ignore an 11 p.m. curfew and, quote, stay in the street. She made other comments that Republicans say were an incitement to violence. Representative Waters says that she was speaking truth to power. And joining us now is Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director at the Daily Caller. Vince, welcome back. Always so great to speak with you. We have a lot to get to, but I want to start off with Representative Maxine Waters. What did you think of her actions over the weekend in Minnesota and what she said, Vince?
Well, the most obvious comparison to think about is the one that came to us earlier this year. You had Democrats accusing the former president of the United States of inciting the violence that we saw take place on the Capitol Hill on January 6th. You'll note in the speech that he gave on January 6th, he urged his supporters to make their voices heard peacefully. That was one of the phrases he used during that speech. A little hard to say that that particular phrase was incitement, whatever you think of the president's remarks leading up to January 6th. As far as Maxine Waters goes, she was very explicit that she wanted her supporters, she wanted activists across the country to be involved in confronting people. She wanted them to continue to be confrontational. And what does confrontational look like? Well, look no further than what we saw this past weekend and certainly in many weeks over the course of the past year among Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists, as in Portland, for example, a Apple store was set on fire. You had gunshots directed at National Guardsmen over the weekend. And any number of acts of violence and destruction over the weekend that were associated with the very activism, rioting that you've got Maxine Waters out there supporting. So the comparison here, I think, is really obvious. It's that she holds one standard for Republicans and quite another standard for herself. She had accused President Trump of fomenting a civil war for the events that occurred on January 6th. What is she fomenting would be the question for her today.
Yeah, and this isn't the first time that Maxine Waters has maybe so-called stirred the pot. Back in 2018, she told supporters if they saw anyone from Trump's administration, quote, you create a crowd and you push back on them. That said, do you think now disciplinary action should be taken against her? And Vince, what do you think should happen?
She should be held to the same standard that Democrats would hold Republicans to. Although as a matter of whether or not that occurs, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen at all. Nancy Pelosi today suggested that she didn't think that Maxine Waters had done anything in terms of inciting or encouraging violence. So they're letting this pass, and it looks like that's the direction it's going to go. But you're right. You've had Maxine Waters in the past tell people to get into the faces of her political opponents and tell them they're not welcome. That's not political debate. That's encouraging your supporters to intimidate your political opponents and to make it so that there is no debate and rather that they're out of the debate entirely. It's pretty remarkable where we've gone politically.
Yeah, I want to switch gears now just a little bit. Over the weekend, President Biden made reference to a, quote, crisis at the U.S. border, and then he seemed to back away from the word crisis today. What do you make of that, and also his reversal on the refugee cap?
Well, there's a couple of things at play here. One of them is I'm not sure who's in charge of the United States of America, because typically when the president of the United States makes a statement, that is the binding position of his administration. That's the position that they take. So everyone on down from the president would then come out and say, okay, look, this is the position of this president, the man who was elected by the American people. But what was strange about all of this is that you had President Biden indicate on Saturday that he thought that what was going on the border was a crisis. And now today, the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, came out and claimed, no, that is not the administration's position, and that it was the press who misunderstood the president when he said that. They're trying to make it seem like the border itself is not a crisis, but that the causes of the border crisis are a crisis. This reminds me of earlier this year during an interview with CBS, it was during the Super Bowl. Joe Biden had indicated that one of the preconditions for sitting down with Iran to discuss the nuclear deal would be that they cease enriching uranium. He was asked by Margaret Brennan whether or not that was a requirement. He nodded yes during that interview. That very next day at the White House press briefing, Jen Psaki said that the president's nodding was not an indication of the administration's policies. So I'm a little confused about who's in charge if the president's own words and gestures mean nothing.
Well, Vince, so much more we can talk about. Unfortunately, we have to leave it right there. Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director at The Daily Caller. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy.
Well, at the White House, President Joe Biden meets with lawmakers from both parties to push his American Jobs Plan, which critics have blasted as too expensive and wasteful. In the Oval Office this afternoon, the president said that he hopes to reach some kind of consensus, at least in broad terms. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, President Joe Biden with his Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg sitting next to him also told lawmakers he's prepared to compromise on the $2.3 trillion spending proposal.
In the Oval Office, President Joe Biden tries to convince lawmakers from both sides of the aisle the country needs his American jobs plan.
Be talking about, number one, what should be included in the package. Obviously, I put a lot in the package. I think it all should be included. And how to pay for it.
Hitting the road, Vice President Kamala Harris stopped by a technical college in North Carolina.
And we're going to invest in workforce development in a big way.
While in Northwest Illinois, First Lady Jill Biden and Education Secretary Miguel Cardona visited a community college there. Part of the jobs plan calls for spending $12 billion to address community college needs.
Community colleges just meet students where they are, and they help them to be the people they want to be.
Not everyone is buying it. On Twitter today, the GOP ripped into it, saying each job created in Biden's, quote, infrastructure plan will cost the American people $850,000.
Folks, I have good news.
On the COVID front, the White House released a video with the president urging Americans to get vaccinated.
Everybody is eligible as of today to get the vaccine. You have enough of it, you need to be protected, and you need in turn to protect your neighbors and your family. So please, get the vaccine.
The COVID-19 response team says we're in a complicated stage.
On the one hand, more people in the United States are being vaccinated every single day at an accelerated pace. On the other hand, cases and hospitalizations are increasing in some areas of the country.
Also tonight, the White House press secretary says President Biden is following very closely the Derek Chauvin trial in Minnesota, where closing arguments are now underway, and emphasizes that any protests must be peaceful. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
At least 19 people in Niger are dead following an attack by suspected sympathizers of ISIS. The strike happened along the African country's border with Mali. Government officials called it, quote, a cowardly attack by people who claim to be Muslims. India's capital is now in a week-long coronavirus lockdown in order to avert a crisis. Delhi's chief minister says the health system is overwhelmed. With 29 million people, Delhi has fewer than 250 beds for critical care. In the past day alone in Delhi reported more than 25,000 cases and at least 161 deaths. Nationally, India has reported over 271,000 infections in 24 hours. Meanwhile, Israel has eased most of its coronavirus restrictions, and one mom is happy that schools are reopened.
They're back on the daily schedule at school, so it's good.
All Israeli primary and secondary school grades returned to class yesterday. Health officials also ended a year-long requirement to wear a mask in public. However, masks are still required indoors and for large gatherings. More than half of Israelis are vaccinated. A government official in China is criticizing the United States and Japan and praising Cuba's communist leader.
严肃对待中方的关切。
Beijing's Minister of Foreign Affairs accuses the U.S. and Japan of meddling in China's domestic affairs regarding their concern over the prison sentences for pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong. The official also praised Cuba's Raul Castro as, quote, an outstanding leader. Castro announced last week that he is stepping down as the head of the country's Communist Party. Pope Francis is praying for peace amid rising tensions between Ukraine and Russia. Over the weekend, Ukrainian and Russian forces appear to be gearing up for attacks. The United States and NATO are describing it as the largest buildup of Russian troops along the Ukrainian-Russian border since 2014. Joining us now with more is EWTN Newsroom correspondent Colin Flynn. Colin, great to see you. So tell us, what is the situation along the Ukrainian-Russian border like?
Good evening, Tracy. Well, Germany and France have called on Russia to pull back on their growing military forces along Ukraine's border. And this was all triggered by violations of a ceasefire agreement between Ukraine government forces and pro-Russian separatists. According to a local Ukrainian newspaper, there have been 29 ceasefires since the start of the conflict in 2014, each intended to remain enforced, but none of them stopped the violence. Today, the European Union foreign leaders, they met to strategize on how to approach Russia. Although they say they are not able to apply immediate sanctions, they said that they hope to add some pressure. And according to British newspaper The Times, the British warships are preparing to set sail next month for the Black Sea that surrounds the southern coast of the Crimea Peninsula to show solidarity with Ukraine's NATO allies.
And Colin, what was the Holy Father's message to the people of Ukraine and Russia?
Well, Tracy, Pope Francis says that he has been following the grave situation and appealed for the end of the violence. He hopes that gestures can be made to promote mutual trust and foster reconciliation. He says peace is truly needed for the people living there and the people who have suffered greatly from the violence, whether it be losing loved ones or losing their homes. He asked all the faithful who were gathered in St. Peter's Square to pray a Hail Mary with him for peace in the country.
And Colin, do we know, has the church in Ukraine responded at all?
Yes, they have, Tracy. Church leaders in Ukraine have called on the international community to get involved and help resolve the conflict. For example, the Archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Archbishop Shevchuk, he told EWTN News that the Ukrainian people, they live in perpetual psychological fear due to the war and the threat of invasion by Russian troops. He also explained that investing in war is taking humanitarian resources away, like access to the COVID-19 vaccine. He said, "We as a church pray for peace in Ukraine and around the world. Since the war in Ukraine began, our churches have never stopped praying for peace." Tracy?
Yeah, we are praying as well. Thank you so much, Colin. Colin Flynn, EWTN Newsroom correspondent.
Thank you, Tracy.
Coming up, civil rights lawsuit where Catholics seek access to more money for schools. And remembering Prince Philip, how England paid its respects to the Duke of Edinburgh. The Diocese of Charleston has filed a lawsuit against the state of South Carolina. It is challenging an amendment which prohibits public funds from going to private schools. The state Supreme Court has blocked the governor's efforts to provide COVID relief funding to private schools and parents of private school students, citing the constitutional amendment. Joining us now is Jeff Jennings, attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, which is defending the Catholic schools. Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. For those who may not be familiar, can you quickly talk about the Blaine Amendment, the history of it, and also how it pertains to this case?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. The Blaine Amendments go all the way back to the late 1800s. They were born of bigotry towards Catholics. They were designed to prevent government funds from going to Catholic schools, and they're still being used today. In this case, it's being used to prevent COVID relief funds from going to private schools and Catholic schools in South Carolina, because the law has a discriminatory past towards Catholics, and also particularly in South Carolina towards African Americans as well, who attended private schools. We filed this case under the 14th Amendment to vindicate the right of equality. And then this case also forwards freedom of religion as well.
Yeah, and in addition to the Diocese of Charleston, I understand that South Carolina independent colleges and universities, which includes 5 historically black colleges and universities, is a co-plaintiff in this case. Can you talk about the significance of that and how all of these institutions are being impacted and the amount of COVID relief funding that's actually being withheld from them?
Right, yeah, so we have a very diverse coalition of clients in this case. I think it just really shows that freedom of religion really benefits a lot of different types of Americans. And same thing with equality under the law. There's millions of COVID relief funds that could be going towards these private schools here in South Carolina, around like 30 million. It's a lot of money. And if we're successful, the Blaine Amendment struck down, the money that Governor McMaster is already allocated to these private schools will be released, and all the working class families who attend these schools, a lot of the families who attend private schools in South Carolina are lower income, working class, and this money will be a huge help to the schools that are serving them.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people impacted financially by the pandemic over the past year. Jeff, what comes next in this case? And ultimately, what do you hope to achieve?
Yeah, so we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction. We're asking the federal district court judge to rule on this as quickly as possible so we can get the money released to the schools in this situation to help the families out as quickly as possible. So in this particular case, we're hoping to have the Blaine Amendment struck down, get the money to the working class families, help them out during these trying economic times that have been caused by government shutdowns and everything related to COVID. And more broadly, we're hoping that this will set a precedent that exposes the discrimination towards Catholics that Blaine Amendments represent. And hopefully this will carry over into other states that have Blaine Amendments as well.
Jeff, thank you so much for your time today, and please keep us posted on this case. Jeff Jennings, attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, which is defending the Catholic schools. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Up next, Encounter with Christ. Pope Francis shares a message of faith with those in St. Peter's Square. And 16 years later, we remember the day Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI was elected. On the surface of Mars, it is a milestone for NASA's experimental helicopter, Ingenuity.
Ingenuity has performed its first flight of a powered aircraft to another planet.
The flight duration was a brief, just 39 seconds over a modest span of 10 feet. Still, NASA is celebrating. Symbolically, Ingenuity carried a piece of fabric from the Wright brothers' flyer from Kitty Hawk. 5 more flights are planned. A senior archbishop in Ireland is denouncing the government's new regulations on public worship. Archbishop Eamon Martin calls the measures draconian. The measures forbid large indoor gatherings with few exceptions. Public masses in neighboring Northern Ireland were allowed to resume earlier this month. The United Kingdom and the royal family said goodbye to Prince Philip on Saturday. Queen Elizabeth II sat alone during the somber funeral at Windsor Castle in accordance with strict social distancing rules. Just 30 mourners were allowed inside of the chapel, while the royal procession and funeral was shown live on television. The nation honored the former Duke of Edinburgh with a moment of silence. Prince Philip died earlier this month at the age of 99. Pope Francis gave his Sunday address in person yesterday after weeks of broadcasting inside of the Vatican's library due to Italy's lockdown measures.
Non esiste un cristianesimo a distanza.
Greeting the faithful in St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father said there is no such thing as being a Christian from a distance. It is a true encounter with Jesus Christ. He adds, when we are nourished by the Lord, we are transformed, and from His love, we are able to reach out to others. And finally tonight, today is the 16th anniversary of the election of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI. As the faithful waited in St. Peter's Square following the first conclave of the new millennium, which lasted less than 2 full days, the 78-year-old German cardinal was unveiled as the new pope. He was installed a few days later as Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict stepped down in 2013. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.